Good afternoon. I'm International Director Radhi Spear. Welcome to #BeginWithin, presented by Sarah Khan. If we look all around us, echoes of fear pit us against each other. Fear is the fuel that feeds the fire of hate. Although our differences in perspectives, ideologies, and opinions can divide us, practices of the heart can empower and unite us. To impact lives and inspire change in this world, we must first learn to feel with the heart of another. Yet, that is only possible through introspection. As the saying goes, you cannot serve from an empty vessel. Through her heartfelt inspirational life journey, from a victim of prejudice to a now passionate peacemonger who has been featured in Forbes and Toastmasters magazine, Sarah Khan uncovers the practices of the heart. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Khan with #BeginWithin.
Welcome, anxiety, my old friend. That's a strange way to begin a talk, isn't it? Anyone here goes by the nickname anxiety? Okay, maybe I spoke too soon. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the city of gusty winds and deep dish pizzas. And for those who didn't know, the birthplace of the most daring president in US history. See, I bet you guys didn't know that. So I'm from Los Angeles, California. Yes. No, but nobody's cheering for me. That's all right. I love Chicago, I do. You know, I was here a couple weeks ago to do for a speaking presentation, and I took the Uber to the event. And during the drive, I was just chit-chatting with the Uber driver. So, you know, this really sweet Pakistani fellow with a melodious accent. And I asked him, Khalid, what do you like the most about Chicago? He says, Oprah. As in Oprah Winfrey, right? Which makes sense. I mean, everybody loves Oprah, right? Right? Perhaps even more than everybody loves Raymond? And then I said, Khalid, what do you like the least about Chicago? He says, here we only have 2 seasons, winter and construction. Is that true, Chicagoans? Anyway, so do you know why I welcomed anxiety before welcoming you all? Well, because I have known anxiety much longer than I've known anyone in Toastmasters. Yep. Now, it all began the summer of 2011. I want you all to picture this brightly lit room, okay? It has carefully arranged furniture and the delicate aroma of clinical cleanliness. Now, there's more motivational quotes on the walls than shared on Facebook. So you can only imagine, right? Now, I'm seated on this nice, comfortable, suede green couch. And across from me is my therapist. Now, today, people see me as a professional speaker, a peacemonger, and a pretty woman, right? And I'm not going to argue with the latter. But you know what? I wasn't always the bold and the beautiful. I'm just kidding. I was born beautiful. But for a long time, the only label I wore was of a mental health patient. Yep. Don't be too surprised, because the academics tell us that there's quite a few of us around. Yep. In fact, did you know that at some point, 1 in every 3 people will suffer from a mental illness? Yep. 1 in every 3. Can you imagine what that means? I want you to do something for me right now, all right? I want you to smile at the person sitting to your right. Or your other right, doesn't matter. Very easy exercise. Yeah. Smile at the person sitting to your left. So if those two people sitting on either side of you seem normal, one in every three. Well, speaking of normal, back in the early 90s, I migrated from India to America in pursuit of the American dream. Now, by that, I don't mean owning a 7-Eleven. But that American dream was the last thing on my mind on September 11th, 2001. On 9/11, when America came under attack, fear took over our country and doubts became justified. People started questioning not only our nation's security and their personal safety, but also the loyalty of fellow Americans of Muslim faith. Sometimes, out of ignorance, we'll end up lashing out on those who seem to represent the very group that hurt us, isn't it? And that's exactly what happened here. American Muslims at large became victims of hate, prejudice, and violence, succumbing to the rise of Islamophobia. Tell me something. Have you ever been judged or criticized or treated differently based on how you look, how you sound, or where you're from? Okay. Now imagine being bullied in public because of your physical appearance and their ignorance. Now, as an easily identifiable Muslim because of my hijab, I became a convenient target for Islamophobic attacks. I've had random people yell profanities at me at malls. I've had parents fearfully pull their kids away from mine at parks. I've been told, "Get out of my country, you camel jockey." And that's sad, Not only because it's hateful, but also because in India, we ride elephants, not camels. But this vitriol was my reality. It was hard leaving my house because I never knew what day would bring me and my kids angry glares or verbal abuse. And a human heart can only take so much hurt until it drops at a breaking point. 2008. One summer, that day I was in the parking lot of a grocery store with my infant in my arm and my toddler by my side, when this tall, blonde, white woman saw me and she launched into a tirade of abuse. "Get away from my car, you effing terrorist!" Now, her car was parked right next to mine. As she started yelling profanities, my little boys were petrified. So I grabbed both my kids and scrambled towards the store. Next thing I know, in her white SUV, honking aggressively, she started accelerating straight towards us. She missed us by a mere foot. Believe it or not, there were people around who noticed my anguish, but they just walked along as if nothing happened. There was this one bystander who saw me and said with a gesture, "I'm sorry." Sobbing, I drove to the police station. Now, they listened to my complaint sympathetically, and then they sent me back home with, "We're sorry." Even though sympathy may seem natural, it may seem respectful, it may seem humane, but simply feeling sorry for someone who's been treated unfairly does very little for the wounded heart, isn't it? The least we can do is acknowledge their pain and speak out against the causes behind it. Because speaking up is what will eventually compel us to do something about the injustices that we witness. And that is why today, when we see women or immigrants or the disabled or the LGBTQ fighting for their basic human rights, or when we see parents and children being detained and separated from each other, or when we see women demanding accountability for having been treated as sex objects, then their struggles should hit all of our hearts. Because even though none of us might have been in that exact same situation, I'm sure at some point in our lives we might have experienced discrimination or inequality or injustice or even harassment. Isn't it? So even though none of you here might have endured an Islamophobic attack, can you still feel my pain? And can you have it in you to say that the cause behind it was wrong? Well, it gets worse. After that parking lot incident, I withdrew into a shell and developed a social phobia. A phobia of white Americans. And do you know what happens to our fears when we allow them to brew? They get stronger and more potent, and our reactions become justified to us. That's what happened when some Americans developed a phobia of Muslims, which led to Islamophobic attacks towards us. And that's also what happened when my phobia of white Americans eventually turned into agoraphobia, where I couldn't leave my house from fear of all strangers. This one weekend, my husband was out of town. And I realized at night that I had run out of milk. Now, I couldn't step out of my room, let alone my house, from fear of the hatred outside my four walls. So I just sat there all night, holding one kid in each arm, tears streaming down my eyes, watching them as they cried themselves to sleep. Hungry. I was falling apart. And no matter how hard I tried to hide it, I felt like a failure. Have you ever had that immense pressure to have your act together all the time? To always be perfect? The perfect parent, the perfect employee, the perfect spouse. Okay, wait. There is no such thing as a perfect spouse, right? Okay, so it's universal. But there's nothing wrong in striving to be better. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we try to be perfect, it prevents us from opening up about our flaws and failings. Isn't it? It prevents us from reaching out for help or support because we fear being labeled as weak. Now, when societal pressure to be perfect is so high, even before that label of weak is stamped on us from the outside, we stamp it on ourselves due to our own insecurities and feelings of inadequacy. Now, when I started noticing my older son, Jibril, exhibit similar fears in public places and around fellow Americans, I became consumed with shame. The guilt that my little boys would grow up to be weak just like me, it was eating my insides. So I knew that I had to do something for the sake of my children. Now, here's what happens when there's no empathy towards those who are already struggling with a lack of self-worth. Now, when I shared my Islamophobia experiences with a few members of my community, these are some of the ways they tried to console me. One person said, if I were in your place, I would have told them off. Another person said, you should have done X, Y, and Z. Some people have solutions to all problems, isn't it? Right? As long as it's someone else's problem. Yeah. Yet another person tried consoling me by saying, "Aw, you poor thing." Do you know what sympathy does? It makes the person who's distressed feel even more pain and disconnected from the listener. Why? Because the sympathizer is choosing to distance himself from the pain of the person he's consoling. Yet another person tried consoling me by saying, "Well, at least you're better off than those Muslims who are being killed around the world. You should be grateful." Let's be honest here, friends. No matter how well-intended, okay, any statement that begins with "at least" and ends with "be grateful" seldom succeeds in making you feel better, right? I mean, imagine your boss is treating you horribly, and I say, "Well, at least you have a job, be grateful." Feel free to quote me on this. Consoling by comparing is not comforting. My personal suffering over being both verbally and physically attacked and having it being labeled as trivial can feel as intense to me as the suffering of a person recently diagnosed with terminal cancer, or the suffering of a person who recently lost their job, or even the suffering of a person who recently had a breakup. Do you know why? Because pain is personal. Because pain is relative. And because when pain hits, it doesn't distinguish between the ones who deserve to experience it and the ones who don't. So tell me, have you ever had friends or family members console you like this, thinking that they're making you feel better? Yeah? Have you ever consoled someone like this, assuming that you're making them feel better? Now, when I confided in my religious study teacher, Lubna listened to me patiently as I poured my heart out and cried. And then she said, "Sarah, I feel with you." And then she reassured me that if she were in my place, she probably would have reacted the same way. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Now, it's not the same as "I feel for you." That's sympathy. "I feel with you" is empathy. Pointing out what we did wrong or what we could have, should have done, that doesn't make us feel any better. It only drowns us further in shame, self-blame, and feelings of inadequacy, which we already harbor. We've already been beating ourselves over the head with a hammer, and the last thing we need is for you to lend us a hand. Right? Right? Believe it or not, all we want is to be seen, to be heard, and to be understood. Because when our feelings are expressed and validated, that's when they receive some semblance of relief. These simple words of empathy can provide so much healing because it humanizes pain. Now, when Lubna encouraged me to seek professional help, I actually took her advice because I already trusted her because of her empathetic and non-judgmental attitude towards me. Now, seeking professional help is not as easy as it sounds. I mean, wouldn't you agree that there's an element of shame associated with mental health illness, still making it a taboo subject in most societies, right? And that's why we feel like we're left with no choice but to hide behind masks of perfect lives. Until that mask becomes so suffocating that the only way to let it go is to let go of life itself. The recent tragic suicides of world traveler Anthony Bourdain and designer Kate Spade, they serve as a stark reminder. I'm sure we all know of friends or family members who've suffered from anxiety or depression all their lives, yet never sought treatment, or they never confided in someone for support. But what are people going to, I have an image in the community. What are people going to think about me? What are people going to say? We are so afraid of being judged by others that we will hide our sorrows behind our smiles because we live by the motto, never let them see you sweat. But you know what? Even though vulnerability is uncomfortable, it is so necessary. We feel like we are isolated in our pain and suffering, in our flaws and imperfections. But believe it or not, those are precisely the qualities that help us connect with one another. You know what? Let's just put mental health issues aside for a moment, all right? Because I need to grab some water. So why don't you guys tell me if any of these internal thoughts sound familiar? What if I'm not qualified enough for that job? What if I get my heart broken again? What if I can't take a selfie with Sarah? Sounds familiar? Okay, fine, just the first two, not the third, right? Or maybe for some, just the third. Well, what if I tell you that to be vulnerable is to be human? Because it means that you care, that you have a heart and a soul and an ego. Would you then be willing to lean into the discomfort of vulnerability? Embracing vulnerability takes bravery. Because when we're willing to take on a challenge without the guarantee of success, when we're willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work in the end, when we're willing to take risks, we are being brave. And the first step to embracing vulnerability is to acknowledge that there is a real fear that exists. And once we have acknowledged that, then we are ready to move through that fear. So when I chose to embrace my vulnerability, I was ready to move through my fear by seeking professional help. And that's how I landed up at that therapist's office at Linden Oaks Hospital's intensive anxiety care program. Now, at the hospital, during our group therapy sessions, all of the patients of various anxiety disorders would sit in a circle in this large room, okay? To my right was Mr. OCD. To my left, Miss PTSD. And as for me, Miss Congeniality. I actually held two titles, Miss Social Anxiety Disorder and Miss Agoraphobia. Now, our first exposure therapy exercise would be to introduce ourselves to the class, right? So the whole drill that starts with, hello, my name is. Right? Have you ever had anxiety over the fear of having anxiety? Yeah? Yeah? Well, guys, my anxiety was so intense that when my turn came to introduce myself, not only couldn't I remember what to say, I couldn't even remember my name. The hot flush of embarrassment I felt every time that happened over the next few days could have easily been avoided with name tags. Now, I remember this one time during our one-on-one conversation, I was talking to my therapist, Joanne, and I was sharing with Joanne my Islamophobic experiences. And then suddenly Joanne got all teary-eyed and she looked at me and said, Sarah, may I give you a hug? I'm thinking, OMG. She looks as tall, white, and blonde as that white American lady in the parking lot. Does she want to hug me? Now, as she held me tightly, I'm thinking, please tell me you don't own a white SUV. Then with, all teary-eyed, Joanne looks at me and she says, Sarah, I feel with you, and I'm here for you. You know what? Joanne's tears were real. Her feelings came from her heart. And in that moment, not once did I think, oh my God, she's my therapist. Why is she crying? No. Crying is therapeutic, even for a therapist. In that moment, I felt more connected to her than anyone else. To stand in someone else's shoes and see through someone else's eyes is a vulnerable choice to make. Because in order to feel empathy towards another and to connect with them, we must connect with something in ourselves that understands those painful feelings. It takes a lot of courage and willpower to revisit our own past vulnerabilities. But that is what is needed if we truly want to connect with one another. You know, that one authentic moment with Joanne, that was probably the reason I didn't quit therapy the first week. Now, the following week, during our group therapy session, our therapist asked us all to close our eyes. And then she said, repeat after me. Welcome, anxiety, my old friend. My old friend? Really? I mean, the world champion Dhananjaya, he's my old friend, and he's not painful. Okay, sometimes he is. But anxiety, that's painful, right? But then she told us something very interesting. She said, we all have a choice. Now, what she meant was not when it comes to feeling anxious or depressed, but how we relate to the painful feelings that we experience. In other words, we can change our response to pain. You know, she reminded me of a quote by Viktor Frankl, the author of Man's Search for Meaning. He once said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our freedom. So the questions that we need to ask ourselves are, how do we relate to pain? Right? And how do we change our response to pain? Well, here's the thing. Pain is inevitable, which means that we are all going to experience pain at some point in our lives. But suffering is optional. And suffering is equal to pain plus unwillingness to open up to it. So instead of labeling pain as a negative thing, if we start accepting it as an inevitable part of life, then the more we open up to pain, the less will be our period of suffering. So we need to allow pain. Now, allowing pain by opening up to it is not as easy as it sounds, right? I mean, what comes instinctively to us is either suppressing or avoiding or ignoring painful feelings, isn't it? But you know what? Such strategies almost always backfire. Let me give you an example, okay? Imagine that you're in a forest, all right? And then suddenly you're confronted by a grizzly bear. Would you run? No. Well, unless you are Usain Bolt. But the grizzly will still catch up to you and kill you. Would you fight the grizzly? Oh, thank God nobody said, of course, this time. Yeah, unless you're Muhammad Ali, yeah. But he will still shred you into pieces. Would you give a motivational speech to the grizzly? See, I can still see some of these Toastmasters people going, yeah. Stop it. It won't work. Well, unless you're Sarah Khan, in which case it would die an instant death. I wish. So what is your best chance of survival? Believe it or not, stay calm and play dead. Yes, the grizzly will scare you, perhaps toss and turn you around, but when he notices that you're not panicking, guess what? He will eventually move on. Now imagine our anxiety is like that grizzly, huge and scary. Now, if we try to run away from anxiety, eventually it'll catch up to us and show us its scary face. If we try to fight anxiety by suppressing it, it'll still show us its scary face and possibly overcome us. So our best chance of survival? Open up and allow it. Just like we allow the grizzly to come and leave on its own, we must allow those feelings of anxiety to come and leave on their own accord. Thank you. So now that we know the why, okay, why should we allow pain? Let's look at the how. How should we allow pain, right? How should we even open up to it? Well, here's the thing. You know, when we stop identifying pain as a negative thing and start identifying it as an inevitable part of human experience, and when we stop judging and labeling ourselves as weak or flawed every time we feel the pain of being anxious or depressed, that's when we'll eventually be willing to open up to pain. Now, after that day, every single morning, right before the hello, my name is exercise, I would close my eyes and whisper to myself, welcome, anxiety, my old friend. So when I started to consciously make that choice to allow pain, from that day onwards, I never forgot my name. Yeah, not kidding. I mean, even until today, you know, even during interviews, even TV interviews, when people ask me, Sarah, what do you consider your biggest personal achievement? Do you know what I tell them? Being able to remember my name. And then they look at me all confused. So tell me, who here has never experienced hardships in their life? Okay. Now, if someone did raise their hand, please see me outside after this talk. I will make sure you experience pain, all right. So wouldn't you agree that hardships and adversity trigger feelings of pain, right? Whether it be emotional or physical or psychological, right? But what is the purpose of pain, you might ask? You know, there was once a disciple, and he would complain a lot about the hardships in his life. So one day, a sage interrupted him and said, did you know that a flute can make no music if it has no holes? A flute can make no music if it has no holes. Imagine each one of us is like the flute. And each one of us releases our song when we allow our spirit to pass through the holes of our experience. Experience is the purpose of pain. And when we allow ourselves to experience painful emotions without shame, blame, or attaching self-labeling judgments, then we remove the fuel it requires to burn us. Now, after stepping out of the anxiety program, I was equipped with enough coping skills, but I didn't know how to implement them in my day-to-day life. So one day, I had a friend over for coffee, and we were just chit-chatting when she mentioned that she had recently joined an organization to overcome her fear of public speaking. Yeah, it gets fun now. Yeah. And then very excitedly, she said, Sarah, why don't you join Toastmasters too? You're going to love it. And then she went on and on and on and yeah. Just like our district council meetings. But then I told her, I'm not afraid of public speaking. I'm only afraid of white people. She said, Sarah, think about it this way. Right now, you're learning how to ride a bike by reading about it without actually getting on it. Now, if you join Toastmasters, you're going to have the perfect platform to do exposure exercises on yourself while confronting your biggest fear. Because trust me, dear, there's tons and tons of white people there to scare you. So I took her advice. I searched for a Toastmasters club in my area, and when I found the number of their VP of membership, I gave them a call and I said, hi, I want to join your club, but I have really bad anxiety. Now this happy, peppy voice replied, that's terrific. Then our club will be the perfect club for you. Seriously, guys. Only Toastmasters can make you feel excited about having anxiety. And all of those VP of memberships, how many VP of memberships do we have in this room? Yeah, these guys are very convincing, aren't they? Right? I mean, they could even convince world champion Darren Tay to wear his Calvin Klein's inside. So I was convinced to join the club. So I remember, when I walked into my first meeting, I just kept, reminding myself, saying to myself, okay, Sarah, stay focused. You are not here to overcome your fear of public speaking. You are here to overcome your fear of white people. And believe me, guys, my friend was right. There were tons and tons of white people there, just like here. And they were all smiling and applauding for no reason. Yeah, just like that. Now, initially, every meeting would induce a panic attack, and no matter how hard I tried to avoid getting picked to speak, somehow I'd always be randomly selected. Yeah, just like American airport security. Yeah, eventually it became excruciatingly painful to just sit through meetings from the constant fear of what-ifs. You guys know the what-ifs? Yeah? What if I get picked to speak again? What if I make a fool of myself again? What if this happens? What if that goes wrong? How many here are guilty of catastrophizing? A sage once said, overthinking or overanalyzing a problem can make you feel like a cow trying to shoo a fly. That'll never go away. It may seem like we are creating solutions or we are preventing ourselves from discomfort in that moment, but we're actually causing ourselves more suffering, isn't it? Well, anyway, so after having stayed in Toastmasters for 3 whole months, I felt like I deserved a short break. So I took 4 months off. I went back to therapy. Now, at my therapy one day, our therapist had a very interesting mindfulness-based coping skill for us to ponder upon. The actions of confidence come first, the feelings come later. So this came from acceptance and commitment therapy. So I went home, I did some research, and then I found out that it meant that no matter how many what-if thoughts are crowding our mind, and no matter how anxious or nervous those thoughts are making us feel, our feelings still don't have to dictate our actions. Which means that we can actually physically start doing things despite those painful feelings, and eventually we will start feeling confident. Now, this is not the same as fake it till you make it, okay? Yeah. Fake it till you make it implies faking feelings of confidence till you make it. Now here, you don't even have to fake feelings of confidence. All you need to do is embrace your vulnerability, allow pain, and take action. And you will make it. That's interesting, isn't it? Right? It reminds me of the time when I was agoraphobic. And I felt like I just couldn't leave my house. Like, I just couldn't do it. Until finally, all it took was me walking 10 feet, turning the knob, opening the door, and stepping out. Which means that no matter how debilitated we may feel on the inside, we can still take action on the outside. So even though I was feeling really nervous and anxious, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to take my action of confidence and I'm going to go back to Toastmasters. And so I did. Now, at my Toastmasters club, I was assigned a mentor named Holly, who was white and Jewish. Yeah. I remember thinking to myself, this is not a good time to be a Muslim. But to my surprise, as we started sharing personal stories, we actually developed a beautiful friendship. But you know, having suffered from Islamophobic attacks for almost a decade, deep down I'd always wonder, what does she really think of me? Not as a friend or a mentee, but as a Muslim. And then one day, Holly and I were chit-chatting, and she told me that she was at a store where she saw a hijabi Muslim girl who looked like me. And she said that girl looked really uncomfortable making eye contact with people. Now, knowing everything that I had gone through because of Islamophobia, Holly said she could feel with her. So she walked by her just to smile and say hello to that girl. And then with a huge smile on her face, Holly says, Sarah, she smiled back. She smiled back. You know, nothing strengthens connection more than the ability to feel empathy towards another human being, to feel with them. And those who receive empathy, they tend to pass it along for others to experience it too. Because empathy is infectious. You know, if we think of our society today, if we reflect on our society, we are becoming more and more polarized, isn't it? Because we are unable to empathize with those who look, think, or behave differently from us. Can you imagine what this world would be like if we could only make an effort to try to understand the other person's perspectives, their emotions, and the motivations behind their actions? Remember, once you can feel with the heart of another, it's very difficult to fear or hate them. Now, when Holly encouraged me to compete at the club level's international speech contest, I was just a newbie to Toastmasters, but I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to take my action of confidence, even though I didn't feel an iota of confidence inside. But I did, and I won. And I won again and again until I reached the district level. Now, for someone with severe anxiety, let's just say that the audience size at the district conference, it feels comparable to the size that gathered at the Lincoln Memorial to listen to Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Yeah. The only difference? The speaker is me. And my speech? I have anxiety. All of the anxiety was still there. All of the what-ifs was still there. The fear of messing up, of humiliation, of blanking out was all still there. The only difference, I was now willing to embrace vulnerability, allow pain, and take action. And just so I don't forget this, I decided to create an acronym for it. EAT. So I'm sure you guys won't forget it either, right? So I won the district contest. Thank you. Just one person. Thank you so much. That's right. And now I'm in Florida, okay? Competing for the World Championship of Public Speaking. So speaking in front of 500 audience members in my international semifinals, this was going to be my biggest exposure therapy exercise ever. But I remember, when I walked into the convention center, I felt like I was in that famous scene from the horror movie, The Sixth Sense. You guys remember that? Yeah? You know when the little boy whispers to Bruce Willis, "I see dead people." Remember that? Yeah? Well, guys, my eyes grew big as I whispered to my husband, "I see white people." Now, throughout the semifinals, I just kept murmuring to myself, "Eat, Sarah, eat." Until a fellow contestant whispered back, "Yeah, Sarah, you should. Eat, Sarah, eat." Only I knew back then what eat meant. And now so do you all, right? So let me test you guys. E stands for? Excellent. A? Excellent. Do we have a best audience ribbon in Toastmasters? No? Well, they should start making one, right? You guys deserve a best audience ribbon, especially the first row right here. So believe it or not, in my very first year in Toastmasters, while having severe social anxiety disorder, I managed to bag the third place trophy at the international semifinals for the World Championship of Public Speaking. Thank you. So let me ask you guys, all right? Tell me, how often have we missed out on a chance at love, on a daring career move, or an exciting investment because we were too petrified by our fears and anxieties, by our what-ifs? You know, when I stopped judging and labeling and beating myself up for having anxiety and instead started opening up to it, that's when I started enjoying myself while speaking on stage, despite the anxiety. And as I started speaking on stage and connecting with my audience, I started to develop close friendships with them off stage. Eventually, those very white Americans who were once the source of my most debilitating fears became my biggest source of support as I took on public speaking as a career. I just don't meet them in parking lots anymore. Now, soon I started speaking at not only large events worldwide, but also having heart-to-heart conversations with patients, with students. You know, sometimes I would speak for hours, and other times I would just sit for hours, listening and validating. And in the end, I would have nothing but just a few simple words to share. I feel with you. So, my dear friends, when we are willing to eat, embrace vulnerability, realizing that to be vulnerable is to be human, allow pain by opening up to it, and take action, irrespective of how debilitated we may feel on the inside, then you know what? We have just practiced the art of loving thyself. And when we are willing to love ourselves, despite our flaws and failures, despite our insecurities and inadequacies, then instead of shaming, we start finding compassion within ourselves to nurture our broken parts. After all, even though broken, all of the pieces are still there, isn't it? So to love thyself is to have the courage to embrace all of life's experiences, the joyful and the painful. Those experiences are the holes in our flute that allow us to make beautiful music. But you know what? I couldn't have discovered the power of self-love on my own. Nope. I needed people in my journey like Joanne, like Lubna, like Holly, who could feel with me. Because their empathy towards me not only made me realize the importance of empathy to create social harmony, but it also led to a more profound realization, which is, if we can be compassionate towards others when we see them suffer, why are we so harsh on ourselves when we suffer? Isn't it? You know, there's a saying, if you treated your friends like you treat yourself, you would have no friends. So I want you all to do something for me right now. I want you all to close your eyes, please. Now, I want you to imagine the face of someone that you love dearly. Could be your close friend or your family member. Now, imagine that you can see them suffering and you can feel their pain. What would you say to this person right now? How about, I feel with you. Now, I want you to imagine that you are that someone that you love dearly. Can you see your own face right now? What would you say when your beloved suffering self opens up to you? How about, I feel with you? You may open your eyes now. Do you know what you just did in this exercise? First, you practiced empathy by showing compassion towards a loved one. And then when you replaced their face with yours and showed compassion towards yourself, you practiced self-love. And guess what? Without self-love, we limit our ability to pour love into the lives of others. Because self-love is the gateway to empathy. Now, I began my talk by practicing self-love with welcome anxiety, my old friend. I would like to end it now by introducing you to your new friend. I don't need this. I can remember, right? Let me try. Hello, my name is Sarah, and I am a peacemonger who passionately promotes peace through loving others by beginning from within. Now, I may not know everything about you or your struggles, but I'm here for you, to feel with you. So let's start a movement where we can all come together to spread love and heal the world, starting from the inside out. Let's begin within.